Good day. I'm making this program early in the morning today because, as I discussed at the tail end of my previous video, I have an urgent personal matter that I must attend to over the course of today, and that, of course, makes it less easy for me to make my video later in the day. The result is that there's unfortunately a real possibility that important news will develop over the course of the day, which I will not be able to cover in this program. If so, my apologies in advance. I will obviously be making my further video shortly after, probably on Saturday, tomorrow, and in that event you will have the update that covering the news which I have missed in this video. Anyway, I'm now going to focus at the moment on the situation in Ukraine, the nature of the fighting there, and I'm going to focus specifically on the fighting on the northern front lines and in relation to the fighting near Kupiansk, because it is now quite clear that it is the fighting in Kupiansk which is now becoming the main part of the battle that is being fought in Ukraine. As I discussed in my program yesterday, everywhere else, in Zaporozhye, on the front lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, in Piatikhatki and Rabotino, and on the Vremevka salient, Ukraine is now at a standstill. The same has been true of the fighting in the Bakhmut area, where Ukraine is bogged down in what appears to be endless fighting to capture this village of Klesheyevka, their major attack in order to try to capture Bakhmut, recapture Bakhmut. The town the Russians now call Artyomovsk appears to have come to a complete standstill. I noticed, by the way, that in an interview to The Guardian, with The Guardian newspaper here in Britain, the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, spoke about continued Ukrainian advances near Bakhmut. She spoke again about how the Ukrainian forces have some kind of artillery dominance over the Russian forces in Bakhmut and keeping Russian forces pinned down there. I have seen absolutely nothing which corroborates those claims from the various reports, frontline reports I've been seeing from the various military correspondents who've been covering the situation in the Bakhmut area and elsewhere in the war. But even Hanna Maliar is now admitting that the situation on the northern front lines, in other words around Kupiansk, is for Ukraine a fast-developing nightmare. The word nightmare was her choice of word, by the way, not mine. At least that is what the Guardian tells us. And we've had some evidence of how seriously Ukraine sees the situation, because General Syrsky, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, who seems to be in overall charge of Ukrainian forces in this area, Zelensky, the overall commander, seems to be running things on the southern front lines in Zaporozhye and the Vremevka ledge and in the Vugleda area. It is Syrsky who seems to command the forces around Bakhmut and on the northern front lines. Anyway, Syrsky has had to dash to Kupiansk. He's made a tour of inspection, and there are Ukrainian reports that he's now reported to President Zelensky that additional forces have to be rushed to the Kupiansk area immediately, failing which there is a real risk that Ukraine's defenses will collapse. Anyway, we had a number of comments about the situation in the northern front lines from various Russian sources, and I'll begin with Vitaly Ganchev, who is the head of the Russian-appointed military-civilian administration in Kharkiv region. The Russians have controlled various settlements in Kharkiv region at various times, including in the past, places like Kupiansk and ETHEREUM and Balakleya. After the events of last autumn, when Ukraine launched a successful offensive in this area, all Russian troops pulled out of Kharkiv region entirely, which would have left Ganchev with little to do. But now the Russians are back in Kharkiv region. They only control a very small percentage of it. They haven't yet recaptured the ground they lost over the course of last year's fighting. But anyway, he is once more back, presumably administering something, and he's able, therefore, to get invitations to appear on Solovyov Live and to give updates about the state of the battle. And he said this. He talked about how Russian troops are now very close to Kupiansk. He said just a few kilometers. They're taking more favorable positions outside certain settlements, positions which Ukrainians held yesterday. Their counterattacks are rebuffed. Our military take their positions, and depending on the utility of the location, the defense line is formed and aligned. And he went on to say, I'm sure that in the near future, the front line will be aligned for a large-scale offensive on Kharkiv, by which I'm sure he means Kharkiv city. Well, we'll see about that. And we always have to be careful with these civilian officials because we don't know to what extent they are privy to the plans of the Russian military. If there is a Russian plan to capture Kharkiv, well, I doubt, to be honest, that they would share it with someone like Ganchev. But anyway, we will find out eventually what the Russians' ultimate plan in this region are. For the moment, they are very close, as I discussed yesterday, to Kupiansk. They seem to be in the process of preparing an attack to capture this village of Sinkovka. If they do capture this village, then they're within a few kilometers of Kupiansk, as Ganchev says, and to all intents and purposes, the Battle of Kupiansk will have begun. Now, there is a much more detailed description of the situation from Boris Rozhin, the Russian military commentator who writes as Colonel Kassad, and who is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting commentators about the war on the Russian side, and who, by the way, is also a very reliable reporter of the situation on the battlefields. And he is someone who emphatically does not inflate the position from the Russian side. In fact, he tends, as far as I can see, to err more on the side of caution and skepticism. But anyway, this is what he has written about the situation near Kupiansk, and I'm taking this from the Slavyangrad channel. I think it's a machine translation, but I think it's been improved by one of the editors there. Anyway, this is what Boris Rozhin has to say about the situation near Kupiansk. What is happening near Kupiansk? The situation in this direction for the armed forces of Ukraine is rapidly becoming more complicated. There are few response options, and none of them is good or even acceptable for the Ukrainian army. During the offensive, units of the Russian armed forces came close to Sinkovka, one of the last settlements before Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Kupiansk, to which the Russian army is only 7 kilometers away, from which the Russian army is only 7 kilometers away, as well as the units of the Ukrainian military based around it, are now located within the zone of destruction of Russian artillery. At the same time, the Russian army has advanced towards Kamienka and Dvorechная to the northeast of in the northeast of Kharkiv region, which has forced the armed forces of Ukraine to stretch their forces and decompress the defense in all of these various directions. For the past 4 weeks, all the border facilities of the armed forces of Ukraine, headquarters of companies and battalions, warehouses with fuel and ammunition, have been actively worked out by Russian aircraft, bombing them with FAB 250 M62 and UPAB 1500 bombs used from a range of 50 kilometers. So what Boris Rogin is in fact saying is that the Russians, by choosing to advance on a broad front rather than launch a sort of concentrated, narrow attack, what they have done is they've forced the Ukrainians to stretch their defense lines. They are short of troops in this area, and in order to hold the Russians back in any particular location, they are having to sort of stretch their defenses. At the same time, the Russians have been working on these defenses, on these Ukrainian defenses, with guided bombs, FAB 250 guided bombs, and UPAB 1500 bombs, which can be launched from ranges of up to 50 kilometers. And then he goes on to say that this, due to which the airspeed, short-range air defense systems of the armed forces of Ukraine, these are French-supplied systems, and the Soviet Strela system do not have the time to react and have been destroyed along with key objects of the Ukrainian army. So the Russians, alongside this broad offensive, stretching the Ukrainian defenses, have been launching bombing attacks on Ukrainian positions and also logistical positions in the rear. After several weeks of airstrikes on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kupiansk district, almost all units of the Ukrainian army have begun to experience a shortage of ammunition. And then he provides a rundown of the Ukrainian forces in and around Kupiansk. And he says that there are 10 large formations of the armed forces of Ukraine, which are left for the defense of Kupiansk. These are the 10th and 36th separate rifle battalions, the 5th separate rifle battalion, the 3rd separate tank brigade, the 14th separate motorized brigade, the 103rd and 105th brigades, which are from the territorial forces. These are much less heavily equipped troops, the 103rd and 105th brigade, but also there are stronger troops, the 92nd Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 132nd Airborne Assault Brigade, the 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade, that will be multiple rocket launch systems, and anyway, that gives us an overview. Basically, 4 brigades of infantry, one of which is a motorized rifle brigade, in other words, a heavy brigade equipped with infantry fighting vehicles, an airborne assault brigade, these are paratroopers, 2 territorial brigades, these are light infantry forces, and a gaggle of different battalions, 2 infantry battalions, and 1 tank battalion. So a significant force, but one which has no doubt suffered heavy attrition over the course of the war. And apart from the 92nd Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 132nd Airborne Assault Brigade, these appear to be basically second-line units. And then Rogin goes on to say the largest forces of the armed forces of Ukraine are deployed to defend the Sinkovka salient, the defense of which, to put it mildly, is complicated by some features of the terrain. Sinkovka and Kupiansk are often compared to Artyomsk, in other words Bakhmut, because of their geographical location. And then he goes on to discuss the importance of this district for the armed forces of Ukraine. He goes on to say both settlements, Sinkovka and Kupiansk, I think he's drawing some comparisons here between Soledar and Bakhmut on the one hand and Sinkovka and Kupiansk on the other. He says both settlements, both of these types of settlements, are located in a lowland and surrounded by hills, which complicates their defense and simplifies the assault using artillery. Another problematic point in the Kupiansk district for the armed forces of Ukraine is the so-called eastern corner, the place where the villages of Kotliarovka and Kislovka are located. And there were some reports, by the way, which I saw, which from recollection seemed to suggest that the Russians have surrounded Ukrainian troops in these two villages. And then Rogin goes on to say, a railway line passes through them. These are these two villages leading directly to Kupiansk, the central logistics hub of the Ukrainian military, not counting Chuguyev and Kharkiv in the Kharkiv region, linking 3 regions of Ukraine. To the south of Kupiansk, in addition to small towns, is Slavyansk, the supply of which may be disrupted if Kupiansk is abandoned by Ukrainian troops. And by the way, I believe that if the Russians do capture Kupiansk, it will be towards Slavyansk, which is in Donetsk region, that the next Russian offensive will focus. As we will see, Rogin appears to have a different view. And then he goes on to say, in addition to the loss of control over the railway communications, the abandonment of Kupiansk by the armed forces of Ukraine may open the way for the armed forces of the Russian Federation to advance towards Shevchenkovo and Chuguyev along the H26 highway. The distance from Kupiansk to Chuguyev by road is 80 kilometers. The direct distance is less than 65 kilometers, which, if Kupiansk is lost by the Ukrainian military, automatically means that it will be possible to work out Chuguyev with long-range rocket artillery and guided bombs, Fab 250 M62. Will the armed forces of Ukraine be able to keep Kupiansk? The main forces of the Ukrainian army are involved in the offensive in Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk, an attempt to hold back the armed forces, the Russian military near Kupiansk, with the help of operational reserves, in other words, troops drawn from central Ukraine who have been held back in reserve, has so far failed. And he then goes on to speculate, most likely in order to create an effective defense along the borders of the Kupiansk district, the armed forces of Ukraine will need to attract strategic reserves. In other words, they will draw on their reserve forces. It is possible, although unlikely, that in order to stop or at least slow down the offensive of the Russian armed forces in this area, the Ukrainian military will remove some units from other sectors of the front. Both options, the involvement, the redeployment of strategic reserves, all frontline units face difficulties arising from the general lack of ammunition and the inability to suppress or at least disrupt the work of Russian aviation, which uses bombs and guided missiles from a distance of 40 to 50 kilometers. In addition, the use of Duran 2 drones and Iskander ballistic missiles against especially important facilities of the Ukrainian military in this area does not stop, which further complicates the defense of Kupiansk and each time requires the involvement of ever larger forces. Now, let me repeat again. Here, Rogin is speculating about a potential Russian advance towards the north if Kupiansk is captured, towards places like Chuguyev, and ultimately, by the way, the city of Kharkiv itself. I firmly believe that the priority of the Russians, if Kupiansk is recaptured, is to move on, recapture some of the territory that was lost last year, potentially ETHEREUM, Liman, Syrsky, which wasn't captured last year, but which is under Ukrainian control, but which the Russians failed to capture last year, which I think was one of the major reasons why their frontline positions there in the north, on the northern front lines, last year lacked stability. But anyway, I think the Russian priority will be to capture all of those places, to recapture the ground that was lost last year, to capture Syrsky as well, and then to press home the attack on Slavyansk in Donetsk region, which it remains Russia's primary mission to recapture, to capture. So I don't think the Russians will be moving north towards Chuguyev or Kharkiv region. That may come, but I think that will be later in the war. I think the Russians will first want to sort out the situation in Donbass. They will want to take physical possession of Slavyansk. They want to drive the Ukrainians out of Donbass, and capturing Kupiansk and perhaps ultimately ETHEREUM and Balakleya, and of course Liman and Syrsky are essential steps towards achieving that. So that is the Russian goal. So we see that Rogin has given us an overview of Ukrainian forces in this area, and he's also given us an overview of the key places of deployment of the Ukrainian military along the Sinkovka ledge. He says that, like Bakhmut, these are on low-lying ground. There is higher ground situated around them. The Russians are gradually pushing the Ukrainians off this high ground. Once the Russians gain control of the high ground, they'll be able to push forward and capture Sinkovka, and also that will put them in a strong position to advance and capture Kupiansk, which is just a short distance beyond Sinkovka and which is now fully within range of Russian artillery. So this is, I think, perhaps as accurate and as detailed a description of the fighting as we're going to get, and it gives us some sense of the operational crisis which is developing for the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, I'm going to make a prediction. I think that in one other respect, Boris Rogin is right. I think that the Ukrainians will not redeploy frontline forces from Zaporozhye or Kherson region, or even from the Bakhmut area, to try to stabilize the situation around Kupiansk. They're much more likely to try to deploy whatever reserve forces they've still kept back. I think that is what Syrsky is now urging Zelensky to do. But of course, doing that sending additional forces from Ukraine's strategic reserve weakens any potential to exploit any notional or conceivable breakthrough that Ukraine might achieve in its own offensive in the south and east of Ukraine. And of course, and perhaps more practically, it means that if there is a big Russian offensive over the next few weeks, Ukraine will have further depleted its forces in advance of it. And I wonder whether that isn't actually more even than the capture of Kupiansk itself, the Russian objective. Ever since the autumn, ever since the Russians launched their offensive towards Bakhmut, they've operated what are inelegantly, and in fact, I personally think inappropriately, referred to as meat grinder tactics. In other words, to borrow a phrase from General Surovikin, who described the strategy in detail back in October, it has been to grind Ukrainian forces down, to put the Ukrainians in a position where they have to defend ground, failing the loss of which could put them in a potentially critical position. That's what happened over the autumn and winter and spring with the Russian offensive towards Bakhmut, and, by the way, which continues with these increasingly desperate Ukrainian attempts to recapture Bakhmut, losing men and machines at a staggering rate as the Russians are able to deploy their greatly superior artillery forces to destroy Ukrainian troops involved in these kind of defensive operations. And I wonder whether the Russians aren't preparing for the Ukrainians a similar plan to the one they executed in the Bakhmut area. They know how important Kupiansk is to Ukraine, so they're luring the Ukrainians into redeploying more of their reserve troops to Kupiansk, which the Russians can then shell and attack and destroy, weakening the Ukrainians further, exacting even more intense attrition upon the Ukrainian military than what we have seen up to this point. So I wonder whether that isn't actually, at least in the short to medium term, the Russian strategy, in which case, by the way, it might be that the Russians do not hurry to capture Kupiansk because they're going to be conducting a kind of Operation Kupiansk meat grinder there instead. And that takes us back to that article by Michael Vlachos, which I discussed 2 days ago, in which Michael Vlachos spoke about the way in which attrition, properly applied, can over time trigger an enemy collapse. And he made some rather interesting comparisons with what happened during the American Civil War with the Confederacy and what happened in the two world wars, especially the First World War with the Germans, that eventually losses mount to the point where they become irreplaceable and unsustainable, and then after a certain period of time, the ability to continue fighting becomes impossible. There is a general collapse in morale and discipline, and eventually the entire defense system collapses. And there are increasing reports, by the way, that some Ukrainian units are suffering from these morale issues. I read a report on Slavyangrad that spoke about the latest Ukrainian attack, or at least attempted Ukrainian attack, in the Vremivka salient area, the attempt by the Ukrainian forces to capture this village in the Vremivka ledge, the Urozhainoye, and the fact that the Ukrainian command cobbled together 4 assault groups from the 4 Marine brigades located in this area to carry out this assault, but 2 of these assault groups simply refused to participate in it. They said that as far as they were concerned, a frontal attack like the one that we're being asked to undertake was tantamount to suicide, and they simply refused to obey orders and to do it. And when that sort of thing starts to happen to an army, that suggests, at least to me, that morale is cracking, and we are getting multiple reports to this effect right across the front lines. And by the way, the Russians have also continued to say that they're getting larger numbers of surrenders and defections by Ukrainian units. So it could be that what is in store is not Kupiansk rapid capture, but Kupiansk Operation Meat Grinder. We'll have to see. Anyway, that's the situation on the northern front lines. It's starting to alarm the Ukrainians. As I said, Syrsky has been rushed to the area. He's made urgent recommendations to Zelensky. Zelensky is almost certain to accede to the requests, Syrsky's request for deployment of reserves, weakening the Ukrainian position, making the entire Ukrainian defense system increasingly brittle, and playing directly into Russia's attrition strategy. Anyway, that's the situation in Kupiansk and in the region around Kupiansk. To reiterate again, everywhere else, Ukrainian advances continue to be at a standstill. There's been no Ukrainian breakthroughs, and one senses that it's increasingly unlikely that they're going to be any. By the way, I understand, though I have not yet read it, that there is another article which has appeared in the New York Times. I've seen brief summaries of it. From what I can tell, it's another case of recriminations. The US blaming Ukraine for not following the combined arms tactics it was taught. This now is the American reason, the official American reason for the failure of the offensive up to this point. And of course, the Ukrainians, for their part, continue to insist that it is lack of weapons. And on that last front, I've noticed that the administration has now finally worked up to making a request to Congress for further assistance to Ukraine. I understand the total that is envisaged is something like the total that's been asked for from Congress to authorize is something like $24 billion, of which $13 billion will be military aid. And I suspect that this is probably enough, assuming that this request is granted, which, by the way, I am certain it will be. This will be enough to enable the United States to keep supplying Ukraine with equipment, with weapons, up to the end of the year, though not before. And it is less, perhaps, than I expected, but I think that, to repeat again, the issue with the United States and Ukraine is not that the United States will ever run out of money to support Ukraine until everything changes, which of course it may do, and perhaps fairly soon, but until everything changes, the United States can simply print money, produce money, it can engage in elaborate accountancy exercises as it has been doing. It's not going to find it difficult to find or pull together funds to continue to cover the cost of supplies to Ukraine. The limiting factor is not money, it is capacity. The fact that the United States is out of ammunition, that it's out of missiles, it's not really happy to supply F-16 fighter jets. It's those kind of things. That is the limiting factor in America's war. And I ought to say that there is at least a chance that if the Russian army does start to go over to a big offensive and to achieve significant breakthroughs on the battlefronts, there is a chance that opposition for further funding of Ukraine might actually grow, in which case it's also possible that Congress might become a bit more leery of authorizing funding, though I still think, as I said, that it will never be funds that the United States lacks when it comes to its support of Ukraine. So there we are. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of funding, there's been an enormous amount of discussion about the situation within the Russian economy. There always is. This is always a topic that never goes away. And as I said, I noticed that it is the decline in the ruble, which is the major talking point at the moment. I've already discussed this. I'm not going to return to it in this program. But I'm going to come back now to the hot topic that we were hearing about a great deal about at the start of the year, which is the situation with the Russian budget. The Russian budget registered a budget deficit of $25 billion in January, and this caused a flutter of excitement across the West. Lots of people were saying that the Russian budgetary position was becoming unsustainable and that the Russians would run out of money and would not be able to keep sustaining the war. And there were all kinds of predictions about this. And as always happens, it has turned out otherwise. And we've now had a fairly detailed breakdown of the budget situation. And I'm taking this from the Russian news agency Interfax. Interfax, I should say, is a unofficial. It's actually an independent news agency in Russia. It is extremely reliable, and this is what it tells us about the situation with the Russian budget. And it says Russia's federal budget deficit was 2.817 trillion rubles in January-July 2023, according to preliminary data from the Finance Ministry. The ministry has returned to the publication of its estimates of the size of the deficit surplus relative to GDP, reporting that the deficit amounted to 1.8% of GDP in the first 7 months of 2023. Now take a step back and think what that means. 1.8% of GDP, that is easily covered. It is a fraction of the American budget deficit, or indeed of the budget deficits of most Western countries. Anyway, the Interfax report then continues to say, the last time the Finance Ministry provided an estimate of the size of the deficit surplus to GDP was in June 2021, after a pause of 9 months, but then it stopped doing so again. But now that pattern has resumed after, well, more than 2 years, and this is what we're told. Over the past month, the size of the deficit increased by 222 billion rubles. That's about $2 billion at current exchange rates. You know, exchange rates change. We shouldn't perhaps make too much of that. In January-June, the ministry estimated it at 2.595, no, it's 2.6 trillion rubles. Overall, a deficit of about 2.9 trillion rubles, or 2% of GDP, is expected for the whole of 2023. However, according to Finance Minister Siluanov, it may amount to 2% to 2.5% of GDP for the year as a whole, and that it says budget revenues dropped by 7.9% year on year to 14.5 trillion rubles in the first 7 months. The Finance Ministry earlier estimated revenues in the first half of 2023 at 12.381 trillion rubles. So based on this, revenues totaled 2.14 trillion rubles in July. So overall, budget revenues are around 8% lower this year than they were last year. And then comes the explanation. Non-oil and gas revenues rose 19.8% year on year to 10.3 trillion rubles in the first 7 months, after growing by 17.8% in the first half. So there's been a big surge in receipts, tax receipts, from the non-energy sector of the economy, which has accelerated in July, pointing to strong economic growth in July. And then Interfax goes on to say the ministry said the dynamic of receipts for the federal budget's largest non-oil and gas revenues, turnover taxes, profit tax, remains steadily positive, including compared to 2021. The ministry also noted that in general, the amount and trajectory of receipts for non-oil and gas revenues shows a significantly higher dynamic that was factored in when drawing up the law on the budget. So, to a great extent, a surge in revenue from the non-energy sector of the economy is making up for a fall in revenue from the energy sector of the economy. Having said that, as we will see, oil and gas receipts the situation there is improving. Oil and gas receipt revenues plunged 41.4% to 4.193 trillion rubles in the 7 months. However, the drop was 47% in the first half, 50% in the period January to May, and 52% in the period January to April. So here again we see that there's been a steady improvement in oil and gas revenues, with a very fast improvement in July. And then the Interfax report says the revision of the mechanism for defining the tax base for oil taxes and the reduction of corresponding price discounts will help to further increase tax revenues in the second half of the year, the finance ministry said. The ministry also said that the use of the National Welfare Fund, that is Russia's sovereign wealth fund, to cover shortfalls in oil and gas revenues and accumulation of extra oil and gas revenues in the National Welfare Fund when prices are high, in line with the fiscal rule, ensures that the budget system is resilient to fluctuations in oil and gas revenues. So Russia uses its sovereign wealth fund as a kind of savings bank. When oil and gas revenues are high, additional funding is placed in it, and when oil and gas prices are low, the National Welfare Fund can be tapped in order to cover any shortfalls in oil and gas revenues. Anyway, the report goes on to say spending rose 14% year on year to 17.341 trillion rubles in 7 months. So there's a significant surge in spending, but the spending splurge is coming to an end. So that was 14% in the first 7 months of the year, but it grew 19% in the first half of the year. So we see that, again, in July, the pace of spending fell, and it fell significantly because spending rose 27% in the period January to May. So the pace of spending, government spending, in the economy is declining. And Interfax says, based on the previously reported spending figure of 14.976 trillion rubles for the first half, spending totaled 2.365 trillion rubles in July. The ministry said the monthly dynamic of expenditure execution reached a normal level following accelerated financing of certain contract expenses in January, February. And we can see that. That deficit that we saw in January was the product of accelerated spending in the January-February period, almost certainly connected to spending on the war. Spending has declined steadily since then because all the big orders were placed in the first 2 months of the year with the increases in production that we are now seeing. And spending, therefore, overall is falling and has now fallen to normal levels, even as tax receipts from the non-energy sector are rising and as oil and gas receipts are rising as well. Now, this huge surge in spending that took place in the first half of this year is almost certainly a major contributor to the weakening of the ruble. The Russian government was spending money at an exceptionally fast rate, placing orders to prepare Russia for the war. And also, no doubt, there was also quite a lot of social spending as well. This extra spending would have been sloshing around the economy, or the extra money thereby generated would have been sloshing around the economy, and it would have had an inflationary impact, and it would have sucked in imports, and that's one of the reasons why imports have been pouring into Russia, partly the result of this huge extra spending. And this extra spending, by the way, will have fueled some inflation, will have caused a weakening in the ruble, and will have been behind some of this big rise in imports. It will also, incidentally, have contributed to higher economic growth, with spending now stabilising, returning to more normal levels. It's likely that economic growth over the second half of the year will start to fall as the economy stabilises. But probably inflation will also start, after a certain lag, to stabilise as well, with already signs that the inflationary rise that took place in July, when inflation rose from about 3.3% on an annualized basis to around 4.3% by the end of July. This is when all that money would have worked through the system. Well, in the first week of August, there's been a fall in the rate of increase in inflation. And in fact, inflation, the annualized rate of inflation, has actually fallen from 4.3% to 4.1%. And the interest rate increase that the central bank carried out in July will have played a role in mopping up some of this hot money that's sluicing around the economy, and the further interest rate rise, which is probably going to happen in September, will most likely do the same. So it's still likely, I'm guessing, that we're going to get 2% growth or thereabouts, but we can see what factors have been driving the economy forward over the last few months. The same factors that have been leading to the uptick in inflation in July, and which have led to the surge in imports, the decline in Russia's trade surplus, and the weakening of the ruble. And of course, as I've also discussed, the weakening of the ruble, which I'm sure has been partly intentionally engineered, against a backdrop of rising energy and food prices, is also going to help budget revenues, and it's quite likely that it will probably also eventually run its course, and it's likely that especially towards the end of this year, or more probably the beginning of next year, we will start to see the ruble start to strengthen again. So this is the reality. This is what is actually going on in the Russian economy. A lot of what we see over the last few months was caused by an unusual surge in spending that took place in the last few months of 2022, the first few months of 2023, as Russia stepped up, pressed the spending accelerator in order to provide itself with the weapons that it needed to fight the war. Now that those big spending items are out of the way, the situation is gradually normalizing. That's it. There is no budgetary crisis. There is no ruble crisis. There is no crisis in the Russian economy. It's not heading towards hyperinflation. Spending is reverting to more normal levels, and we will probably see, absent some new dramatic events on the battlefronts which might require another spending surge again, things are normalizing in the economy, which overall remains stable. So I just wanted to cover all of this because, as I said, so often the heart of the economy is the budget, and we see how the budget system in Russia works. Now, let's discuss a few other topics. The Russians today have launched a moon probe, the first that the Russians have launched since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and indeed the first that the Russians have launched for a very, very long time indeed. To the best of my recollection, they basically stopped sending probes to the moon back in the mid-1970s. So this is a curious decision by the Russians to return to the moon, and it does make one wonder whether perhaps they haven't longer range plans for the moon, perhaps ultimately even a manned mission to the moon. Anyway, we will see. But anyway, they've launched this moon mission. We'll see whether it succeeds, whether the moon probe reaches the moon, and what it does there. But anyway, it's a return to a place which used to be, of course, very much the focus of interest of the Soviet Union in the heyday of its space program in the 1960s and 1970s, just as it was obviously for the United States with its successful Apollo missions, which I very well remember from the late 60s and early 1970s. Anyway, the Russians are once more showing renewed interest in the moon. But putting all that aside, perhaps a more interesting fact, at least for me, other than these launch of these moon probes, is that the Russians also appear to have decided on what will be their new light fighter. There was a lot of speculation about 2 years ago that it was going to be the Sukhoi 75 that the Sukhoi Bureau unveiled at the MAX Air Show 2019 Air Show. It seems that it won't be, and that the Russians have decided to go with the more conservative MiG-35. It's not a stealth fighter jet, but it does have an ASAR radar, and I've seen reports that this will be the next generation light fighter. Cheaper, more reliable perhaps, certainly capable of much better performance, an effective point defense interceptor, and an aircraft that is perhaps easier to sell internationally. And from the perspective of the Russian Air Force, it has the immense advantage over the Sukhoi 75 of having 2 engines rather than 1. So, just saying. I suspect that the Sukhoi 75, which attracted a huge amount of interest when it was displayed by the Sukhoi Bureau at MAX, the Moscow Air Show, that we're probably going to hear less and less of it, and that project will be abandoned. Doesn't seem as if the Russian Air Force is backing it or is interested in it, and there's no sign so far that it's attracting any international orders at all. So just those 2 little things about Russia. And one last but very important thing. In my previous program, I discussed the situation following the coup in Niger, and I mentioned that there was going to be an ECOWAS meeting, and that meeting has now taken place in Abuja. And the ECOWAS group have said that they're now going to press ahead with setting up a rapid deployment force. They want the civilian president restored to power in Niger. They've said that all options are on the table, and part of their statement even spoke about a potential intervention in Niger to take place as soon as possible. So, despite the doubts in Nigeria and perhaps in some other countries, it looks as if this project of military intervention in Niger to restore the former president to power is once more firmly back on the agenda. There seems to be a consensus amongst the ECOWAS leaders that this is essential, and that if ECOWAS fails to carry out this intervention, and if the coup establishes itself and the civilian president is not restored to power, then this will be a major defeat for ECOWAS, and it will damage its long-term credibility. I'm going to say straight away, I think this is probably a mistake. I'm not a great expert on the politics of this region, but it is what ECOWAS has decided to do. And though it's clear that the final decision to send the troops in has not yet been made, it seems to me that the green light has been given, and that is what I expect will eventually happen. So that's what I think is coming, probably another crisis in West Africa. We'll see whether it can be contained. We'll see how easy or difficult the intervention in Niger is. We'll see whether this doesn't result in some kind of festering crisis in Niger, and perhaps an escalation in insurgency activity in that country. But one way or the other, that appears to be the decision that the ECOWAS leaders have taken. So that is the end of my program today. As I said, there'll be more from me tomorrow. May I take this opportunity to wish you all, again, a very good day, to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. That you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And also please remember to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of great things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.